Welcome back to another Robocraft 2 update video where I get to get you up to speed on Robocraft 2 developments while also mixing in a fair degree of speculation and feedback. First up, FreeJam have come out with clarifications concerning the ways that they intend on limiting the bot designs of players. Bot designs would be limited by caps on, firstly, the base CPU of bots, which one would use for chassis blocks and other parts like joints, movement parts and logic parts. Secondly, the weapon CPU of bots, for which one would be able to use on actual weapon parts. Thirdly, the cosmetic CPU of bots, which probably means parts with no use other than appearances. Fourthly, the number of clusters or independent sections or entities that CPU can be divided between in the same bay. There is plenty to unpack here, both positive and negative, and on this point I note that there is nothing mentioned or perceived that I deem to be unsalvageable, so it is good to point these things out early. So let me start by going back to base CPU. This is the meat and bones of most builds, and one will be able to spend up to 1000 or more CPU on these kinds of parts. On this point, FreeJam also mentions that, quote, a single shape uses up a single base CPU, unquote. This concerns me because in Tech Blocks, a game which was not originally designed with combat in mind, the same CPU costing of parts was also used. So let us think about the ways that this could be implemented for a moment. The first option, which was the case in Tech Blocks, is where as a part gets stretched to multiple blocks worth in size in all three basic dimensions, the weight and potential health of the part, as expressed by the surface area of connections, is increased. You see, in Tech Blocks, individual parts don't actually have a health value, but the physical connections between parts can be severed. That was mostly fine for a non-combat version of the game, but Robocraft is going to be a very different game with parts being impacted by weapon blasts. As such, I cannot really see a situation where individual parts do not have a health value, so that a direct hit may potentially weaken or even disintegrate them. Now, the problem here is that what FreeJam is telling us is that a block part will cost 1 CPU regardless of how big it is, and therefore its effectiveness or actual durability as a part. This poses a problem from both a balance standpoint as well as an aesthetic standpoint, as players seeking to min-max their builds will quickly enough introduce Robocraft 2 to a chunky craft meta, where as many oversized and greater toughness per CPU parts on their builds are placed as they possibly can. Even if one were to go down an alternative route, where health and toughness is distributed among the entire span of the part, where a block twice as big has the same health, regardless, would still result in a situation where larger blocks would tend to have a lower toughness per volume than the base block parts. Both of these scenarios pose balance challenges that I am not sure that FreeJam fully appreciates as of yet. That is the problem, the following is the solution, or at least a solution. Rather than determining that block parts regardless of size are of the same CPU cost, instead opt for a CPU cost and a set value per volume for a given block part. This would be a lot better from a balancing standpoint and would be inherently scalable by design. Additionally, it would become a lot more possible for different materials applied to a shape to modify the overall CPU cost and characteristics of the block parts. It could be that FreeJam are intending for all materials, present and future, to be balanced to be worth the same, but in truth there is no reason as to why that needs to be the case. A part made out of rigid plastic may have a few perks over a part made of sheet metal, but the latter material is likely more costly and has better overall properties. More on this later. That was base CPU. Let's talk about weapon CPU. A player will be able to invest up to 500 CPU into weapon parts on any single build. Any weapon CPU that a player does not use for a build can be used to expand the normal base CPU limit of 1000 CPU. So spending only 300 CPU on weapons means that one can spend up to 1200 on other parts using the core CPU. Now, two things to point out here. Firstly, 1000 plus 500 equals 1500 CPU. This is 500 CPU less than the size of normal bots in Robocraft 1. I'm going to leave Cosmetic CPU to the side for now. Secondly, the 500 weapon CPU limit means that only up to a third of all CPU on a bot can be in the form of weapons. Considering that a weapon in Robocraft 2 is only going to constitute a part of the actual weapon system, which will likely include the weapon's housing and turret and logic systems, it is a little unclear as to whether the weapon CPU limitation is even necessary. But one thing that I can tell you is that players will generally not like having what they can spend their CPU used upon being limited for arbitrary reasons. There will always be players who wish to run glass cannons. Perhaps more disturbing, looking at this user interface, it is not clear that Megabots are planned to be a thing in Robocraft 2. The two bars for core CPU and weapon CPU meet when the total CPU between them hits 1500. Considering that in Robocraft 1, bots with a third more CPU can be built, with no CPU limit on weapon investments, and considering the apparent lack of consideration for Megabots, it is very difficult to look at this information in a vacuum and say that this qualifies as Robocraft but better. With that being said, we also need to remember that Robocraft 2 is a different beast from Robocraft 1, and that comes with a number of considerations. Firstly, the introduction of weapon CPU does allow for game modes to set up a cap on weapon CPU. Racing modes come to mind, and this can be helpful to, for instance, prevent bots with weapons to participate in the mode. This may be true, but I do think that weapon or other limits should be imposed by the game mode that the bot is being designed for, not through the base bot build interface. For instance, a racer mode could have a 1500 core CPU limit and a 0 weapon CPU limit. If a bot is designed beyond the boundaries of a mode, then the bot simply won't be playable in that mode, and a player may adjust the build if desired. Something along those lines. Now, on the subject of Megabots, if one looks at the user interface closely, the truth is that it can still support Megabots if there is a desire to do so, but only if the bars of the interface are overlaid with new bars representing the Mega CPU investments. Since regular bots are being limited to 1500 CPU, it is a little doubtful that Megabots will be as mega CPU-wise as in Robocraft 1, and some individuals may find that a bit disappointing, but once again, Robocraft 2 is a different game with different technical constraints. Well, that covers core and weapon CPU. Before I continue, I do feel that I need to appeal to FreeJam to consider inflating all CPU costs and limits by 10. So numerically speaking, what would normally cost 1 CPU would then cost 10 CPU. Why would I ask for this to be so? Well, the primary reason is that this is a change that promotes balancing parts to a finer degree than the lower amount allows for. It furthermore enables a more meaningful costing of block parts depending on volume and material applied. And one new CPU being worth 0.1 old CPU is much more user-friendly than introducing decimals to the current CPU system. Okay, that aside, we now come to Cosmetic CPU. There doesn't seem to be much to say concerning this. It is likely that cosmetic parts will be similar to core parts in that their integrity comes from their connections rather than themselves. But it is also likely that cosmetic blocks will have next to zero integrity to speak of, kind of like how cosmetic parts in Robocraft 1 have zero health to speak of, annoyingly enough. It would certainly be an improvement if unused CPU on a given build may be spent on giving cosmetic parts a material profile, where in the absence of such, the part is basically paper. I would suggest unused cosmetic CPU to also be usable for this purpose, but I have a feeling that premium players will have a higher cosmetic CPU cap, and that is fine if they are forced to invest the same pool of regular CPU towards material profiles, because a premium player with twice as many cosmetic parts simply has more parts to distribute the CPU investment between, meaning more fragile parts. Probably. With all forms of CPU out of the way, this brings us to the cluster limit. This is a big deal. An anticipated cluster maximum of 10 means that a player can choose to have up to 10 independent creations as part of their build. This could be a getaway vehicle as part of the first bot, although it will be interesting getting out from one pilot seat to get into another if so. This could be a second bot or a series of smaller bots. This could be a cluster designed to do a lot of damage through its own sacrifice, such as in the case of a missile. This could be a supporting element, like a turret of some sort. There are so many possibilities. Going back to the concept of getaway vehicles, it is my opinion that it would make sense for FreeJam to come up with parts designed to lock a cluster in place with another cluster, and to react to logic and send out signals as per its design, or even to ignore certain inputs while the cluster is still connected, probably through the use of logic. This would enable things like launching missiles from a wing mount, like a jet fighter, or enabling the player's pilot seat to be embedded in the getaway cluster, which itself is embedded within the main outer bot cluster, which accepts instructions for as long as it is connected, and perhaps even beyond, depending on whether the logic allows for it and what parts are incorporated, such as a remote command module. So yes, some ridiculous stuff to consider, and this just from talking about a single update. Exciting stuff. I do have one more thing to comment about concerning this, and this is the user interface that FreeJam have presented. Now, I understand that this is an early work in progress, but it is my view that this, especially as regards CPU remaining, is more than a little confusing. Additionally, the text print is fine enough to be somewhat difficult to read, especially on the bars themselves. As such, here are a few tips for improvement. Most simply, use a thicker font size. Since the background is a mid-tone, I would actually suggest going for a white text with a black outline and maybe even a further shadow around the text so that it remains readable regardless of the contrast of the background color. Secondly, specify the overall remaining amount of CPU. There is this nice space in the middle of this bar, which is perfect for displaying it. And also drop the numbers in the brackets. They too are confusing, and players will quickly figure out that as they build on CPU of one type or another, their remaining CPU diminishes. In terms of adapting this user interface with Megabots in mind, when a player would go over the 1500 CPU limit for normal bots, begin a second overlay bar over the normal one, kind of like in the same way that beat-em-up fighting games represent health with multiple layers of health bar. One could have one layer of Mega CPU usage, or it may be desirable to have multiple tiers of Megabot CPU usage. That was a lot to say about CPU, and now I'm going back to blocks yet again, this time because the most recent piece of news from FreeJam concerns how players will be scaling blocks. Okay, that's very interesting timing, great timing. The most important changes mentioned concern the processes of clicking and dragging that it will involve for players to place and create larger shapes. When you are suddenly stretching shapes to many times the length of a single block, you need to understand that it will take a little more commitment to get things just right. Promising here is FreeJam's stated expectation that Robocraft players are likely to get used to the new system before long. FreeJam are also implementing a user interface assist that they are calling the Gizmo, which is a guiding element that will be used to guide players with their placement of blocks. It seems to be intended to help orient you to the way that you are about to affect the scaling of the block being placed, and any guiding tool is a good thing, just be sure not to feed it after midnight. While it is not yet mentioned, it needs to be pointed out that it would also be a very helpful feature if players could have a parallel edit mode where blocks aren't placed but are instead modified. The way that this would work is that when a player clicks on a face of a part desirable of editing, the entire shape may be expanded or shortened along that one axis. This would mean that in order to scale up a shape along all 3 dimensions, it would require 3 edit processes, but it would be a big step up in customization as parts can now be expanded or contracted to make way for that thing that it was getting in the way of. If one wants to think up additional features for the edit mode, then the ability to move parts around on a build without modifying its dimensions would also be terrific. Bonus points if it works well with mirror mode, of course. On a different note, FreeJam have also announced that they are improving the scaling system of parts by adding a Bevel rendering system and a Tri-Planar texturing system. And I admit that I have to Google that. And after that, I'm totally not reading the announcement verbatim when I say that it allows for materials to be mapped seamlessly over connected blocks and smooths the sharp edges, allowing the lighting to catch the edges in a more realistic way. Yeah, basically it should make things look better. Exciting stuff, but what I would still like to see is scaling parts also scaling in CPU cost, in which case one could reasonably expect CPU limits to increase accordingly. Or alternatively have a very good reason not to go down this route be brought to my attention. That would be appreciated. There is more. FreeJam have given us the first glimpse of what a switch plate will look like, which is what players will be using to spawn in new bots during matches. The plan at this time is for a switch plate to exist in the team's base for the purpose of respawning and changing bots. The plate looks nice, but I'm kind of expecting to see projectors in the ceiling around the base plate projecting triangular rays of light to spawn in the vehicles. An immediate potential problem here is traffic. If a player spawns in, for example, 4 different bots as part of their bay, then it will take some time to vacate the plate of creations. That can also either mean that a plate will not be available until vacated, or that things will get messy as multiple creations get spawned in upon each other. In my view, a solution to this is to include an automatic laser conveyor system that shifts all creations out of the switch plate automatically, perhaps in a spiral going around the switch plate, or it might be desirable to have the sidewalls of the switch plate removed so that only the 4 raised corners remain. This would allow for the conveying of creations off of the plate in 3 or 4 different directions before a traffic situation occurs. Or one could go for the spiral method, that's also a possibility. It is also my opinion that there should be another very different plate that can be used to recycle and feed collected scrap from the battlefield onto. This too would reduce any potential traffic problems at the switch plate, because there's one less use for it. On a completely different note, FreeJam have been establishing channels of communication via which they can gain feedback from prospective players and other interested parties. There is their Discord, now with the new forums Discord feature enabled, and there is their subreddit page, both of which I shall link down in the description below. That is all I have for you for the moment. I know that I spent more time commenting and speculating about the new thing rather than actually covering the information itself, but I do hope that I've both kept you informed, as well as having gotten you and FreeJam thinking not only about what Robocraft 2 is becoming, but also what Robocraft 2 can be. And now I would like to hear from you, and I will meet you down in the comments below. What is your take on FreeJam's announcement of the various bot CPU limits? Is it important to you that Megabots be a part of Robocraft 2? Does the prospect of stretching shapes to achieve smoother angles than ever possible in Robocraft make your creative senses tingle? Does the prospect of using a switch plate to spawn in a new creation spurn any feelings or thoughts? And do you think that your machine will be able to handle the full glory of the graphical settings of Robocraft 2 set to the max? The answer to the last one for me is very probably not, but we'll have to see. Oh, and before I go, I noticed that I'm crossing the 200 subscriber threshold, and I just want to thank you for that. And, of course, thank you for watching.